back at the APOR conference in Hollywood, Florida, with Chris Wlezien from Temple University, who is going to be presenting a paper in about an hour about election markets, election prediction markets. First of all, for anyone who just doesn't know, what is a prediction market?
A prediction market is basically a stock market where the goal is to predict some future outcome or event. And in this case, we're talking about election prediction markets. So what people are doing is they're basically buying and selling shares in candidates, and they have value. There are two kinds of markets. One's a vote share market, and the price on election day, if you bought it, it held it. In 2008, for instance, if you had a share of Obama on election day, it'd be worth 53.5 cents, or thereabouts. And if you bought it for 40 cents, a few months earlier, sold it for 53.5, you would have made a tiny, 33% profit or something. There's a winner-take-all market, which is much more interesting. Here, you either get paid $1 or nothing. And so if you had an Obama share on election day, you earned yourself $1. And if you had a McCain share, you got nothing. It's much more interesting, much more fluid.
Right. So what have you learned about how these work and how they work as compared to polls?
Well, we've done some work in the past. There was a paper published at last year's Public Opinion Quarterly, which looked at just these electronic markets, which are internet-based, have been around since 1988. Iowa electronic market is maybe the most famous. In these markets, we compare these markets with polls and then poll projections, and we found that whereas the polls, when you match them up with market prices on a daily basis, tend to be closer to the final result, the projections from polls, looking forward to the election outcome, actually do better than markets.
And what are those? I mean, how did you derive those?
Well,
if you can, in 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, the idea was simply that it didn't make a whole lot of sense to us to take a survey asking people what they're going to do tomorrow, 200 days before an election, and comparing that with a market which is trying to forecast. And so what we did is said, well, we have to convert that into a forecast, that poll. So we went back historically and looked at polls 200 days out and election results and did a statistical analysis that allowed us to make that projection.
Okay. So what do we do with this?
Well,
should we start ignore prediction markets? Should we? Do they both have different purposes for different tasks?
Well, the paper we're doing here actually it may shed some light on that. I'm not sure. We're going back in time and looking at markets beginning in 1880. There were real, honest to goodness markets, and very thick. $37 million a year was wagered on these markets. Each election. One year in 1916 there was $167 million. We're talking a lot of money by comparison with the thousands and tens of thousands which are invested in the Iowa electronic market. So you had real markets back then, and now you have what are relatively small markets by comparison, although some are getting bigger. What we were interested in doing in this paper is saying how markets did prior to polls compared to later. What we found is early markets before polls were around did really, really well at the end of election campaigns, without any benefit of polls, in many years even straw polls. Since then, markets haven't done so well. Polls still do a lot better than markets since in a one-on-one matchup, but early markets fare pretty well.
Have you looked just beyond this paper at how the prediction markets fared in the primaries last year? Because there's an example of where polls were off in a number of places. Did the prediction markets outperform the polls in New Hampshire or in South Carolina or in North Carolina and the other places?
I can't give you any systematic evidence on that. My sense of it, I watched it quite closely, as you might have expected, is that in some cases they did better, in some cases they didn't do so well. But the key to keep in mind is that it's not really comparing polls straight up with markets is probably not. If there's one message we have, at least our prior work and some of this work is matching up polls and market prices, well in advance of an election just doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Okay, maybe that's a good place to wrap this. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Mark.